The velvet rope felt like a cold iron shackle against my wrist as the security guard's grip tightened. I wasn't a criminal. I was a 67-year-old widow holding a single wilting white rose on the one night I was promised I'd never be alone. The manager didn't call me old, and he didn't call me a nuisance, but as he signaled the guard to pivot me toward the freezing rain, his eyes said it all. In a world built on vibes and energy, my grief was a blemish they needed to erase. I had built this empire, I had funded these marble floors, and yet I was being dragged out like a ghost that refused to haunt quietly. Wait, before we dive into the dark secret behind why I was really kicked out that night, I want to know, have you ever felt invisible in a place you once called home? Drop a comment with where you're joining us from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to the moment my life changed forever. The rain did not fall in London. It hammered. It was a cold, rhythmic assault that turned the city's limestone facades into weeping monuments. Inside the back of the Jaguar, I watched the droplets race across the glass, tracing jagged paths that reminded me of the silver veins on the backs of my own hands. I was 67 today, a number that felt like a heavy woolen blanket, scratchy and suffocating. Beside me on the heated leather seat sat a single white rose. It was an avalanche rose, Arthur's favorite. Its petals were so white they looked blue in the twilight, but the edges were already beginning to curl, turning the color of bruised parchment. It was dying, just like everything else. "We're here, madam," the driver Roberts murmured. His voice was devoid of warmth, a mechanical utility provided by the firm. He didn't say happy birthday. He hadn't been instructed to. I stepped out, and the wind immediately snatched at my breath. My knees gave a sharp, crystalline pop, the sound of a body that had been loyal for 6 decades finally beginning to rebel. I smoothed the front of my vintage Chanel coat. It was a relic of a time when my silhouette commanded boardrooms. Now, it just felt like a costume for a play that had long since closed. I approached the gilded atrium. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was the cathedral of the city's ego. She and Arthur had funded the original renovation 30 years ago. The brass handles on the doors had been chosen by my own hand. As I pushed inside, the warmth hit me, not like a hug, but like a fever. The air was saturated with the scent of roasted pine nuts, expensive musk, and the sharp, metallic tang of champagne. It was the smell of new money, loud, fast, and utterly indifferent to the past. At the podium stood a young man whose hair was gelled into a stiff, defiant crest. He was looking at a tablet, his thumb flicking across the screen with a speed that made my eyes ache. He didn't look up. He let me stand there for 35 seconds. I counted every one of them by the ticking of my heart. "Name?" he finally asked, his gaze still glued to the blue light of the screen. "Margaret Thorne. Table 14. The corner alcove." The flicking stopped. The young man looked up, his eyes scanning me from my sensible shoes to my damp hair. There was no recognition. To him, I wasn't the woman who had revolutionized the local textile trade. I was a type, an elderly woman, a slowing factor. "I don't see a Thorne on the list for tonight, ma'am," he said. His voice had that flat, nasal pitch of someone who had been trained to be polite while being derogatory. "Check again," I said, my voice dropping into the low, gravelly register I used to use when I was firing a lead architect. "My husband and I have sat at table 14 every February 14th for 42 years. It is a standing arrangement." The young man sighed, a long, theatrical exhale. "Ma'am, standing arrangements died with the landline. We are a digital-first establishment. Table 14 is currently occupied by a party of 4 influencers, I believe. They've been booked for months." I felt a slow heat rise in my chest. It wasn't the heat of anger. It was the heat of a burning library. I am not interested in influencers. I am interested in my husband's memory. It is his anniversary. It is my birthday. Call the manager. Call Simon. "Simon is at our Dubai location," the boy said, a small, cruel smile touching his lips. "And even if he were here, the policy is clear. We are a vibrant space. We prioritize the energy of the room. A solo diner at a prime table on Valentine's Day? It's bad for the atmosphere. It dampens the mood for the couples. Dampens the mood." The words felt like physical blows. I looked past him into the dining room. I saw the couples. They were young, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones rather than each other's eyes. They wore affection like a leash, performative, loud, and shallow. "I have the money to buy this entire floor," I whispered, my pride flaring up like a dying ember. "I'm sure you do, ma'am," the boy replied, leaning forward. "But you don't have the vibe. You're wearing a coat from 1994, and you're carrying a dead flower. You're making the guests at the front tables uncomfortable. They come here to forget that age exists. You are a reminder." He signaled to a large man standing by the cloakroom. "A security guard." "Ma'am, let's make this easy," the guard said, placing a hand on my elbow. The grip wasn't violent, but it was firm. It was the grip of a man removing a piece of trash that had blown in through an open window. I looked around. A woman in a shimmering gold dress at the nearest table leaned toward her partner and whispered something. They both laughed. They didn't see a woman. They saw an obstacle to their perfect evening. "I built this," I said, my voice trembling as I was steered toward the revolving door. "I chose the marble for these floors." "Watch your step, ma'am," the guard said. "It's slippery out there." The glass door spun. The transition was violent. One moment, the gold leaf warmth of the elite. The next, the biting, indifferent slap of the winter rain. I stumbled onto the sidewalk. My umbrella was still in the car, and Roberts was nowhere to be seen, likely circling the block or taking a break he thought I wouldn't notice. The white rose fell. It hit the wet pavement and was immediately trampled by a passerby in a hurry. The pristine white petals were ground into the gray slush of the gutter. I stood there, my hair matting to my forehead, the rain soaking through my expensive wool coat. I felt invisible. For decades, I had used my wealth as a fortress, thinking it would protect me from the indignity of being old. But in the dark, under the neon glare of a city that was moving too fast to see me, I realized the truth. Money can buy you a seat at the table, but it cannot buy you the right to be seen. I felt a sob rising, raw, ugly sound, when I saw a pair of work boots stop in front of me. They were leather, scarred with deep gouges, and caked with dried mud. "That was a hell of a thing to watch," a voice said. I didn't look up. I didn't want to be seen like this, a broken queen in a gutter. "Go away," I snapped, my old thorns still sharp. "Can't do that," the voice replied. "My daughter thinks you're a lost star, and she won't let me move the truck until we make sure the star finds its way home." I looked up. Through the blurred lens of my tears, I saw a man who looked like he had been carved out of an old oak tree. His face was a map of hard work, deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that looked like it had weathered 1,000 storms, and hands that were thick with calluses. Beside him, a little girl in a yellow raincoat held out a hand, not to take my purse, but to offer a small, crumpled tissue. "Don't cry," the girl said. "It's just water. The sun is just hiding." I looked at the man. This was Elias. He was the antithesis of the gilded atrium. He smelled of sawdust and cold air. And for the first time in a year, someone was looking Margaret Thorne directly in the eye, not as a type, but as a person. "I have nowhere to go," I whispered. "Well," Elias said, tilting his head toward a battered pickup truck idling at the curb. "The diner down the street has terrible decor, but the heaters actually work, and the waitress doesn't know what a vibe is. She just knows what hungry is. You coming?" I watched the taillights of the Jaguar fade into the mist, realizing that the driver I had paid for a decade didn't care if I caught pneumonia or disappeared into the night. But as I climbed into the cab of Elias's truck, the atmosphere shifted. The interior smelled of cedar shavings, old coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of the little girl's bubblegum. It was cramped, the heater hummed with a rattling protest, and the springs in the seat were shot, but for the first time in 67 years, I felt like I wasn't being managed. I was being moved. "I'm Elias," the man said, shifting the truck into gear with a heavy clunk. "And the one currently trying to see if your pearls are real is Sarah." I looked down to find the little girl inches from my neck, her eyes wide with a terrifyingly sharp intelligence. "They're real, aren't they?" she whispered, as if we were sharing a state secret. "They're very old," I replied, my voice still shaky. "Like me." Sarah shook her head solemnly. "No, they're classic. My daddy says classic things never break. They just get seasoned. We arrived at the Rusty Spoon. If the gilded atrium was a cathedral, this was a bunker. The fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythmic hum that usually would have triggered a migraine, and the menus were laminated sheets that felt slightly tacky to the touch. But as we sat in a corner booth, a waitress named, who looked like she had been carved out of the same hardwood as Elias, slapped 3 glasses of water onto the table without a word. She didn't look at my Chanel coat with envy or my age with pity. She just looked at me as a customer who needed a hot meal. Why? I asked Elias, as Sarah began to methodically color the back of a placemat with a stubby blue crayon. You saw a woman being humiliated by the elite. Most people in this city would have pulled out their phones to film it for a laugh. Why did you stop? Elias leaned back, his large hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The skin across his knuckles was scarred, the marks of a man who fought with materials every day. Because I know that manager, he said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. Not personally, but I know the breed. He's the kind of man who thinks the world is a gallery and everything in it is a statue. He doesn't see people. He sees assets. I spent 10 years working for people like that, building their mahogany staircases and their hidden safes, only to be told to use the service entrance. I felt a pang of guilt, a cold needle in my heart. I had been one of those people. I had walked past 100 Eliases in my time, never wondering where they went when the sun went down. And what do you do now? I asked, trying to steer away from the mirror he was holding up to my soul. I have my own shop, he said, and for a moment, a flash of pride lit up his tired eyes. Vance Custom Woodworking. It's small. It's struggling. But every joint is hand-cut and every finish is hand-rubbed. No particle board. No plastic. No lies. Vance. The name hit me like a physical blow. My breath hitched, and for a moment, the diner seemed to tilt on its axis. Arthur had a sister, Clara Vance. She had been the black sheep, the one who ran away with a carpenter's apprentice against the Thorne family's wishes. Arthur had searched for her for years, but the family lawyers, acting on my own cold instructions to minimize distractions, had told him she had vanished. I had suppressed the private investigators' reports. I had buried the letters she sent, fearing her common life would tarnish the Thorne brand. I looked at Elias, the broad shoulders, the slight cleft in the chin, the way he tilted his head when he listened. He was Arthur's nephew. He was the blood heir to a textile empire he didn't even know existed. And I was the woman who had effectively orphaned him from his history. Is something wrong, Margaret? Elias asked, his brow furrowing. You look like you've seen a ghost. I took a sip of the lukewarm tea, my hands trembling so violently that the liquid slopped over the rim. I just realized I haven't introduced myself properly. I lied, the words tasting like ash. I am Margaret. Just Margaret. Well, just Margaret, Sarah chirped, sliding her placemat across the table. I drew you a new flower since yours got squashed. This one can't die because I used the forever blue crayon. I looked at the drawing. It was a crude, vibrant blossom, but it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in decades. It wasn't an avalanche rose. It was a lifeline. As we ate, Elias talked about the struggle of his shop. He spoke about a predatory firm that had bought his lease and was raising the rent to push him out. He didn't know the firm was Thorne and Company. He didn't know that the signature on the eviction notice, though signed by my son Julian, was authorized by a board I still chaired. Every word he spoke was a lash against my back. He was my family, and I was his executioner. The slow burn of the evening turned into a fever. I realized that my son, Julian, hadn't just forgotten my birthday. He was actively dismantling the very world Arthur and I had built, turning it into a soulless machine of greed. He was hunting men like Elias, men who shared his own blood, for an extra 2% on a quarterly report. I need a carpenter, I said suddenly, the plan forming in the dark recesses of my mind, a blend of desperation and a burgeoning, icy rage. Elias paused, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. Ma'am, I have a property, I continued, my voice gaining the steel it had lost at the restaurant. An old estate in the hills. It's been neglected. The library is rotting. The grand staircase is a shadow of itself. I've been looking for someone who doesn't use particle board or lies. Someone who understands that the wood has a memory. Elias looked at me with a mixture of hope and skepticism. That's a big job, Margaret. A job like that requires a lot of overhead. I'm not sure I have the standing for an estate like that. You have the hands, I said, reaching across the table and placing my wrinkled hand over his scarred one. And I have the time. I'll pay the deposit tonight. But I have one condition. Elias narrowed his eyes. What's that? You bring Sarah. A house that's been silent for a year needs the sound of forever blue crayons. I didn't tell him that I was taking him into the heart of the Thorn estate. I didn't tell him that I was about to use him as the catalyst to burn down my son's corporate greed. I was a thorn, after all. And while I had learned kindness from a stranger, I hadn't forgotten how to fight. Before we continue to the moment I brought him to the manor, the moment where my son Julian was waiting with a legal trap that almost ended us both, I have to ask, do you believe that some secrets are better left buried, or does the truth always have a price that must be paid in full? The drive to the Thorn estate was a journey through a graveyard of my own memories. As the truck groaned up the winding gravel path, the headlights cut through the fog, revealing the jagged silhouettes of the ancient oaks Arthur and I had planted when we were young and full of foolish fire. Elias stayed silent, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, while Sarah pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging up the window. "Is this a castle?" she whispered, her voice trembling with. "It's a mausoleum, sweetheart," I murmured, though she didn't know what the word meant. A place where things go to be forgotten. When we pulled up to the grand portico, the front door swung open with a violent suddenness. Julian stood there, framed by the amber light of the foyer. He looked like a masterpiece of artificial perfection. His suit was tailored to the millimeter, his hair was a sleek helmet of charcoal, and his expression was a cocktail of condescension and repressed fury. He didn't look at me. He looked at the battered pickup truck as if it were a leaking garbage bag left on his doorstep. "Mother," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous silk. "I've been calling Roberts for 2 hours. He told me you'd had an episode at the restaurant. I assumed you were in bed. Who are these people? And why is this vehicle dripping oil onto the limestone?" I climbed out of the truck, ignoring the sharp protest in my hip. "This is Elias Vance, Julian. He is the master carpenter I've hired to restore the East Wing Library. And this is his daughter, Sarah." Julian's laughter was a sharp, barking sound that lacked any trace of Meyerty. "A carpenter? Mother, we have an entire infrastructure team for the estate. We use Tier 1 contractors. This man looks like he's here to haul away the scrap metal. Look at him." Elias stepped out of the truck. He didn't shrink under Julian's gaze. He stood tall, the scent of cedar and sawdust a defiant challenge to Julian's expensive cologne. "The scrap metal is usually what's left after Tier 1 contractors are done with the job," Elias said calmly. "I'm here to save the wood." Julian's eyes narrowed into slits. He saw the fire in Elias, and more importantly, he saw the way I was looking at him. For 30 years, Julian had been the only sun in my sky, purely because I had extinguished all the other stars. Now, he felt the temperature dropping. "We're taking a quick breather here. This is where things get truly twisted. Julian thinks he's in control, but he has no idea he's staring at the cousin he's been trying to bankrupt. If you were in Margaret's shoes, would you tell Elias the truth now, or wait until Julian is completely ruined? Let me know in the comments if you're Team Truth or Team Revenge." "He's not stepping foot inside with that child," Julian snapped, stepping forward to block the threshold. "This is a private residence, not a daycare for the help." "It is my residence, Julian," I said, stepping into the light. My voice was no longer the weary whisper of an old woman. It was the voice of the woman who had built the Thorn name from a single loom. "I own 60% of the trust that maintains this land. If I want to host a circus in the grand ballroom, you will buy the popcorn. Elias and Sarah are my guests. Move." The psychological warfare was silent but deafening. Julian eventually stepped aside, but as we walked past, he leaned in and whispered into my ear, "You're making a mistake, Mother. Senility is a tragic thing. Don't make me prove it in court." The next 3 weeks were a slow burn immersion into a world I had forgotten existed. Elias didn't just work. He communed with the house. He spent the first 3 days just touching the walls, feeling for the moisture, listening to the creak of the floorboards. Sarah followed him like a shadow, carrying his level or his tape measure with a solemnity that broke my heart. I sat in a velvet armchair in the corner of the library, watching them. I watched Elias strip away the layers of cheap, high-gloss varnish Julian had ordered years ago to modernize the room. Underneath, the English oak was gasping for air. "You see this, Margaret?" Elias asked one afternoon, pointing to a dark stain near the base of the fireplace. "Someone tried to hide a crack here with wood filler and paint. It's like trying to heal a broken bone with a Band-Aid. You have to open it up, clean it, and give it a new piece of heartwood to graft onto." "Can everything be fixed, Elias?" I asked, my gaze drifting to the portrait of Arthur hanging above the mantel. "If the roots are still healthy, yes," he said, looking at me with a strange, searching intensity. "But sometimes you have to cut away the rot first. And that part hurts the tree." As the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that Julian wasn't just neglecting the house, he was systematically stripping it. I found legal documents in the library wastebasket, notices of sale for our original looms, the ones Arthur had spent his life perfecting. Julian was liquidating the history of the Thorn Group to fund a high-risk venture in synthetic fast fashion. He was killing the soul of the company to buy a bigger throne. The tension reached a breaking point on a Tuesday evening. The library was nearly finished, the oak glowing with a deep, honeyed warmth that hadn't been seen in decades. Julian entered, not with a greeting, but with a legal folder. "It's done, Mother," he said, tossing the folder onto the table Elias had just polished. "The board has reviewed your recent eccentricities. Hiring a vagrant, bringing a child into a construction zone, the erratic spending. I've been granted temporary conservatorship. You are no longer authorized to sign checks or commission work." He turned to Elias, a sneer twisting his face. "Pack your rusted tools and get out. You won't be paid for this restoration. In fact, I'm suing you for trespassing and damaging historical property by stripping the original finish." Elias looked at the folder, then at me. His face wasn't full of fear. It was full of a weary, crushing disappointment. "I knew it," he whispered. "People like you're all the same. You use us like tools and then throw us in the scrap heap when you're bored." "Elias, wait," I said, struggling to stand. "No, Margaret," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I actually thought you were different. I thought we were friends. But you're just a thorn. And thorns only know how to prick." He grabbed Sarah's hand. The little girl was crying, her forever blue crayon dropping to the floor and rolling toward Julian's feet. Julian stepped on it, crushing the wax into the expensive rug without a second thought. As they walked toward the door, I felt the oppressive weight of my life crashing down. If I let him walk out now, the secret would die with me, and the Thorn name would belong to a monster. "Julian!" I screamed. It was a sound that hadn't left my throat in years, a raw, guttural command. He stopped, smirking. "Don't exert yourself, Mother. The car is waiting to take you to the wellness retreat I've booked for you." "Elias Vance is not a vagrant," I said, my voice shaking with a cold, sharpened rage. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I had kept hidden for 35 years, the original birth certificate of Elias Vance, and the letter from Clara that I had never opened until last night. "He is your cousin, Julian. He is the son of Clara Vance. And according to your father's final will, the real one, the one I've been hiding in the safe you couldn't find, this house and 40% of the firm don't belong to me, and they certainly don't belong to you. They belong to the first male heir of the Vance line." The silence in the room was so thick it felt like we were underwater. Julian's smirk didn't just fade, it evaporated. He turned to look at Elias, who had stopped at the door, his hand still frozen on the handle. "What did you just say?" Elias whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Julian's face went from a pale gray to a frantic, mottled red. He looked at the birth certificate in my hand as if it were a live grenade. Elias didn't move. He stood by the door, his hand still gripping Sarah's, looking like a man who had just been told the earth beneath his feet was an illusion. "You're lying," Julian hissed, his voice cracking. "That's a forgery. Clara Vance died a pauper in a gutter. She had no heirs. You're just a senile old woman trying to burn the house down because you can't run it anymore. I am many things, Julian, I said. My voice is cold and steady as the marble floors. But I have never been a fool. I kept the secret to protect the brand, to protect you. I thought you were the legacy, but I watched you today. I watched you crush a child's crayon. I watched you treat your own blood like refuse. Arthur knew. In his final days, he saw the hollow shell you were becoming, and he made sure there was a failsafe. Julian lunged for the paper, but I stepped back with a surprising agility, the adrenaline of a 40-year war finally surging through me. It's already been digitized and sent to the firm's lead counsel, Julian, and to the press. By tomorrow morning, the vibrant board of directors you love so much will be answering questions about why the rightful heir of the Thornvance estate was living in a pickup truck while you were liquidating the family's history. Elias finally spoke. His voice was a low, jagged rasp. You knew. All those weeks in the shop, all those lunches, you knew who I was. You were watching me like a specimen in a jar. I was watching to see if you were like us, Elias. I confessed, the tears finally breaking through. I was watching to see if the thorn blood had stayed pure in you, or if it had turned into the poison I see in my son. And I saw it. I saw the way you treated the wood. I saw the way you treated your daughter. You are the man Arthur was. You are the man I failed to be. Julian let out a guttural scream of frustration and turned toward Elias. You think you're a thorn? Look at you. You're a laborer. You're a mistake. You'll never survive in our world. I'll bury you in litigation before you can even find a lawyer who doesn't smell like sawdust. Elias took a slow step toward Julian. He was a head taller and 50 pounds of solid muscle heavier, forged by real work, not gym memberships. He didn't raise his fist. He just stood in Julian's space, the scent of the library, his library, enveloping them both. I don't want your world, Julian, Elias said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I don't want your suits, your vibe, or your soul-crushing board meetings. But I'll take the firm. Not to run it into the ground for a profit, but to make sure that not one more person like my mother gets stepped on by a person like you. And as for this house? Sarah, go pick up your crayon. Sarah scrambled to the floor, retrieving the broken blue wax. Elias looked at the crushed rug. This house needs a lot more than a new finish, he said, looking at me. It needs the rot cut out. Get out, Julian shrieked, pointing at the door. Both of you. This is my house. Actually, Julian, I said, leaning back against the desk Elias had restored. The conservatorship paperwork you filed works both ways. If I am deemed unfit, the estate defaults to the secondary trustee named in the 1985 addendum. That's Elias. You've effectively argued yourself out of a job and a home. Julian looked from me to Elias, the reality of his own arrogance finally caving in on him. He had spent his life using the law as a leash, and he had just tied the noose around his own neck. Without a word, he turned and fled the room, the sound of his expensive leather shoes echoing down the hall in a frantic, retreating rhythm. Before we get to the final payoff, the moment Elias and I sat down for our first honest meal and the way we handled the fallout of the Thorn Empire, I have to ask, if you found out your entire life struggle was caused by a secret your own family kept, could you ever truly forgive them, or would the money just feel like blood? The heavy oak doors of the library didn't just close behind Julian. They seemed to seal an entire era of cold, corporate cruelty. The silence that rushed back into the room was thick with the scent of beeswax and the bitter tang of raw truth. I stood there, my hands still trembling as it rested on the birth certificate, feeling the weight of 35 years of silence finally lifting from my lungs. Elias didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the honeyed glow of the wood he had labored over, looking like a man who had been struck by lightning but was refusing to fall. Sarah was huddled by his side, clutching her broken forever blue crayon like a talisman. 40 years, Elias whispered, his voice cracking. My mother lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat for 40 years. She used to tell me that the Thorn name was a curse, a shadow that followed anyone who dared to be human. She died with her hands swollen from sewing other people's dreams together, never knowing that she was the owner of the very silk she was stitching. I cannot ask for your forgiveness, Elias, I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. I can only offer you the tools to finish what she started. I spent my life building a brand. I want you to spend the rest of yours building a family. Wait, we're hitting the final turn of this journey. The Thorn Empire is in shambles. Julian is in exile, and Elias is standing in the middle of a fortune he never asked for. If you've made it this far, tell me, do you think Margaret deserves a place at this new table, or is her guilt too heavy to ever truly be washed away? I'm reading every single comment. The weeks that followed were a grueling reconstruction of the soul. The press was a shark tank, circling the Thornband scandal with a hunger that would have destroyed us if Elias and I hadn't stood as a unified front. I resigned from the board, but not before ensuring the transition of power was absolute. Julian tried to fight, but the board, always eager to follow the scent of stability, turned on him the moment they realized Elias was the public's new hero, the Carpenter King who had come to save the heritage they were liquidating. But the real work happened in the quiet moments. I moved out of the master suite and into the smaller, sun-drenched guest wing. I didn't want the throne. I wanted the peace of the periphery. Elias moved in, but not as a lord. He brought his scarred workbench into the grand foyer. He insisted on finishing the library himself, refusing to hire a crew. "I need to feel the grain," he told me one evening as I brought him a tray of tea. "If I'm going to live in this history, I need to know every knot and every crack." We established the Clara Vance Foundation, using the Thorn billions to fund vocational schools for independent artisans, craftspeople like Elias who had been squeezed out by people like Julian. We turned the old Thorn textile mills into a cooperative, where the weavers owned the silk and the profit was shared by the hands that made it. One Sunday, exactly 1 year after that rainy night at the Gilded Atrium, I found myself sitting at the massive dining table, the one Arthur and I had used to entertain kings and tycoons. But the table was different now. Elias had stripped the dark, oppressive varnish away, revealing the natural, honest grain of the wood beneath. Sarah was sitting at the head of the table, her hair messy, her face smudged with flour from a birthday cake she had insisted on making for me. Elias sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up, his hands still caked with the dust of the day's labor. There were no waiters. There was no vibrant energy or carefully curated vibe. There was just the sound of Sarah's laughter and the smell of a home-cooked meal that wasn't designed to impress anyone. "Happy birthday, Grandma Margaret," Sarah said, sliding a plate toward me. The cake was lopsided. The frosting was a chaotic shade of blue, and it was the most perfect thing I had ever tasted. I looked at the empty chair beside me, the place where Arthur should have been. For the first time, the seat didn't feel like a void. It felt like a space held open for the future. I had been dragged out of a restaurant for being invisible, but in this room, under the light of a family I had almost destroyed, I was finally seen. As I blew out the candles, I realized that the greatest pro-revenge wasn't what I had done to Julian. It was what I had allowed Elias to do for me. He had restored the house, yes. But more importantly, he had restored the woman who lived inside it. The Thorn name still exists. But if you walk past the estate today, you won't hear the cold silence of a mausoleum. You'll hear the rhythmic strike of a mallet, the whir of a lathe, and the forever blue laughter of a child who knows exactly who she is. Thank you for walking this long, dark road with me. This story proves that while we can't change the original grain of our past, we can always choose how we finish the wood. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive stories of family, betrayal, and the ultimate payoffs. Until next time.